Number 10. Thomas Silverstein. There are men who enter prison and become prisoners. And then there are men who enter prison and become something else entirely, something the system was never designed to contain. Thomas Silverstein arrived at the federal penitentiary system as a young man convicted of armed robbery. He wasn't supposed to be a monster. He was supposed to serve his time, learn his lesson, and disappear into the machinery of the American justice system like thousands of others before him. That's not what happened. Born in 1952 in New Jersey, Silverstein grew up in instability, a fractured family, early brushes with the law, the kind of childhood the criminal psychologists would later point to as a blueprint for what came next. His first federal conviction landed him in Leavenworth, where instead of rehabilitation, he found something far more dangerous: the Aryan Brotherhood. The Brotherhood didn't just recruit Silverstein, they shaped him, forged him, gave him identity, purpose, in a code built entirely on violence. By the early 1980s, Silverstein had already been convicted of 2 murders inside federal prison, both rival gang members, both killed with the kind of calculated precision that made investigators uneasy. These weren't crimes of passion, they were executions, and each one made him more untouchable within the Brotherhood's hierarchy. Then came September 27, 1982. Inside the walls of USP Marion, Silverstein and a fellow Brotherhood member approached Corrections Officer Merle Klutz in a narrow corridor. What followed lasted only seconds. Klutz was stabbed 40 times. Silverstein reportedly held the body afterward, a deliberate, defiant act meant to send a message not just to guards, but to the entire federal system. 40 days later, he killed again. Officer Robert Hoffman, same cold efficiency, same terrifying calm. The federal government's response was immediate and unprecedented. Marion went into a lockdown that would last 23 years, effectively becoming the template for every supermax facility that followed. Silverstein was placed in what authorities called no human contact status, alone, 23 hours a day, for decades. What makes Silverstein psychologically singular isn't the violence itself, it's the reasoning behind it. In later interviews, he spoke with startling clarity about his actions, constructing elaborate justifications rooted in loyalty, respect, and a prison code most people will never understand. He wasn't erratic, he wasn't chaotic, he was deliberate. He died in 2019, still in federal custody, having spent more consecutive time in solitary confinement than almost any prisoner in American history. The guards who knew him didn't describe him as a raging animal. They described him as controlled, focused, patient. And patience, inside Marion's walls, was perhaps the most frightening quality a man could possess. But Silverstein, for all his notoriety, had company in those corridors. Dark company. And one of his neighbors had committed crimes so calculated, so methodical, that even seasoned federal investigators struggled to explain how one man could be responsible for so much destruction. Number 9. Alton Coleman. Most people know the name Henry Hill. Far fewer know the name Alton Coleman. And that anonymity is perhaps the most disturbing thing about him. Coleman didn't belong to a crime family. He didn't have a network of lawyers or a Hollywood film to eventually tell his story. What he had was something raw, more primal, and in many ways more terrifying, an almost supernatural ability to blend into ordinary life right until the moment he didn't. Born in 1955 in Waukegan, Illinois, Coleman grew up in poverty so acute that neighbors later recalled him rummaging through trash for food as a child. His early criminal record was long and troubling: sexual assault charges, multiple accusations from women and children, a pattern of predatory behavior that law enforcement repeatedly failed to stop before it escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. In the summer of 1984, Coleman and Deborah Brown embarked on what the FBI would later describe as one of the most terrifying crime sprees in modern American history. Over the course of 8 weeks, they moved across 6 states: Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Kentucky, leaving a trail of victims that included robbery, kidnapping, rape, and murder. 8 people were killed. 7 states issued warrants. The FBI placed Coleman on their 10 most wanted list within weeks. What made authorities particularly unnerved was his method. He didn't hide, he inserted himself into communities. He befriended families, gained their trust, and then turned that trust into a weapon. Victims described him as charming, likable even. One family let him stay in their home days before he killed 2 of their members. The capture came in July 1984 in Evanston, Illinois, not through some elaborate investigation, but because Coleman attended a community meeting in broad daylight, apparently unconcerned that his face was plastered on wanted posters across the Midwest. A citizen recognized him. It ended as quietly as it had been violent. The trials that followed were multiple and exhausting. Coleman was convicted in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. He received death sentences in all 3 states, a legal rarity that reflected just how many jurisdictions wanted to claim the right to his execution. Coleman arrived at USP Marion while his appeals wound through the courts. Inside, he was considered uniquely dangerous, not for aggression toward other inmates, but for his psychological unpredictability. Guards noted that he was charming in conversation one moment and utterly vacant the next. He manipulated other inmates for small advantages with the same ease he had manipulated strangers on the outside. Psychologists who evaluated him struggled to fit him into standard diagnostic categories. He showed traits of antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism, and a profound lack of empathy. But what stood out most was his adaptability, his ability to become whoever the situation required. He was executed in Ohio in 2002, but the psychological profile he left behind, the predator who wears the face of a neighbor, continues to inform FBI training to this day. Coleman moved through the world invisibly. The man who came next made no such attempt to hide. In fact, he wanted everyone to know exactly what he was.
Number 8. Larry Hoover.
Not every demon at USP Marion committed his worst acts with his own hands. Some of them were far more dangerous than that. Larry Hoover was born in 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi, and raised on the south side of Chicago during one of the most turbulent periods in that city's history. By his teenage years, he was already embedded in Chicago's street gang infrastructure, a young man with a commanding presence and an instinctive understanding of hierarchy, loyalty, and power. By the early 1970s, Hoover had risen to leadership of a gang that would eventually become the Gangster Disciples, one of the most structurally sophisticated street organizations in American history. The Disciples weren't simply a gang in the traditional sense. Hoover built them with an almost corporate logic: chains of command, revenue streams, territorial boundaries enforced with military precision. In 1973, Hoover was convicted of murdering William Young, a drug dealer, in a dispute over territory. He was sentenced to 150 to 200 years in Illinois State Prison, a sentence that most assumed would remove him from the equation entirely. It didn't come close. From inside prison walls, Hoover continued to run the Gangster Disciples with remarkable effectiveness. He communicated through visitors, letters, and an elaborate system of coded messages. The organization didn't shrink in his absence. It expanded, growing from a Chicago street gang into a national network with tens of thousands of members operating across multiple states. Law enforcement watched with increasing alarm through the 80s and into the 90s. The intelligence coming in was almost unbelievable. a man serving a double-century sentence was actively directing criminal enterprises across the country from a prison cell. Federal authorities eventually transferred Hoover to USP Marion, precisely because of Marion's extreme communication controls. The logic was simple. If you could sever the lines of communication, you could sever the command structure. It was harder than it sounded. Inside Marion, Hoover's reputation preceded him. Guards described a man of quiet authority, someone who didn't need to raise his voice because everyone in his vicinity already understood the weight of his presence. Other inmates, regardless of affiliation, treated him with visible deference. In 1997, a federal RICO prosecution resulted in 6 additional life sentences. The government argued, with extensive evidence, that Hoover had continued to lead the gangster disciples throughout his entire incarceration. What makes Hoover's case psychologically distinctive is the nature of his power. Most dangerous men at Marion were dangerous because of what they could do physically. Hoover was dangerous because of what he could make others do. Across hundreds of miles, across years, across the walls of a maximum security federal penitentiary. The idea that isolation could contain a man like that turned out to be far more complicated than anyone anticipated. He remains incarcerated to this day, now in ADX Florence. His organization, by many accounts, still bears his imprint decades later. Hoover ruled through influence. The man who follows ruled through something far more intimate and far more terrifying.
Number 7. Carl Bowles. Some names never make the bestseller lists. Some cases never get the documentary treatment. And sometimes that absence tells you more about a man's crimes than any headline ever could. Carl Bowles is one of those names. Born in 1943 and raised in rural Idaho, Bowles came from the kind of background that rarely produces federal public enemies. Quiet, agricultural, geographically isolated from the urban crime narratives that dominate true crime. Which is precisely what he became was so jarring to the communities that encountered him. His criminal history began early and escalated steadily. By the time he reached adulthood, Bowles had accumulated a record of violent offenses that should have kept him imprisoned indefinitely. The system, however, had other ideas. In 1965, Bowles escaped from an Idaho state prison. Rather than flee quietly, he went on a robbery spree that resulted in the kidnapping and murder of 8 people, an almost incomprehensible body count for a man who had, until that point, been regarded as a serious but manageable security risk. The victims were ordinary people, motorists, couples, individuals who simply had the devastating misfortune of encountering Bowles at the wrong moment. He moved efficiently, leaving little evidence, covering geography with a speed that confounded local law enforcement in an era before centralized databases and rapid interstate communication. When he was eventually captured, the full scope of what he had done settled over investigators with the slow weight of something they hadn't been prepared for. 8 murders, a calculated escape, a multi-state rampage executed with enough discipline to suggest planning, but enough brutality to suggest something beyond planning entirely. His trial in Idaho produced convictions on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The sentences were substantial enough to ensure Bowles would never again represent a risk to the public, or so the system assumed. That assumption had been wrong before. Federal authorities, deeply aware of Bowles's demonstrated capacity for escape and violence, eventually moved him into the federal system, into USP Marion, where his security classification placed him among the most carefully monitored inmates in the country. Inside Marion, Bowles was quiet, disciplined. He kept largely to himself and generated few disciplinary incidents, a fact that guards found more unsettling than reassuring. They had learned through hard experience that stillness in certain men wasn't peace, it was patience. Psychologists who reviewed his case noted a pattern common to a specific type of violent offender, the ability to compartmentalize completely, to appear functional, even pleasant, while carrying the weight of actions that would psychologically devastate most human beings. Bowles died in prison, never having offered what most would recognize as genuine remorse. His case asks a question that criminologists still struggle to answer. How does a system accurately assess the danger of a man who, on the surface, presents as completely calm? Inside Marion, calm was never reassurance, and the man who comes next understood that better than anyone, because he used that assumption as a weapon.
Number 6. Robert Hanssen. Not all demons at USP Marion spilled blood with their hands. Some traded lives in silence, in encrypted messages, in hollow trees in suburban parks, in the cold arithmetic of intelligence and counterintelligence. Hanssen was by every external measure a model American. Devout Catholic, dedicated family man, 25-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a senior agent trusted with the most classified intelligence the United States possessed. He was also, for more than 22 years, a spy for the Soviet Union and later Russia, arguably the most damaging mole in the history of American intelligence. Born in 1944 in Chicago, Hanssen was raised in a disciplined, demanding household. His father, a Chicago police officer, was by accounts cold and critical, a relationship that psychologists would later examine carefully when trying to understand how a man devoted so much of his life to the systematic betrayal of everything he publicly claimed to serve. Hanssen began passing information to the Soviets in 1979. Over the following 22 years, he provided intelligence that is believed to have contributed directly to the execution of at least 3 Soviet agents who had been secretly working for the United States. He compromised American surveillance operations, weapons programs, and evacuation protocols that had been decades in the making. The damage he caused wasn't abstract. It was measured in lives. What made Hanssen so extraordinarily difficult to catch was his tradecraft, a term intelligence professionals use to describe the methods by which a spy operates. Hanssen never met his handlers face-to-face. He communicated through dead drops, physical exchanges of information left in predetermined locations. He demanded cash and diamonds. He refused to identify himself by name for years, making his discovery almost entirely dependent on a mistake he seemed constitutionally unwilling to make. He was caught in February 2001, caught only after the FBI paid a former Russian intelligence officer for a file that contained Hanssen's fingerprints. 22 years, hundreds of classified documents, 3 known American assets executed because of information he provided. His plea agreement resulted in 15 consecutive life sentences and, critically, a commitment to full debriefing. The government wanted to know everything he had given away, every operation he had compromised, every name he had passed along. He reportedly cooperated extensively, which many in the intelligence community found almost as disturbing as the espionage itself. Hanssen was sent to ADX Florence after his conviction, but his federal processing and holding placed him within the Marion system during evaluation periods. In those settings, guards described a man of remarkable composure, someone who understood psychological dynamics with clinical precision and used that understanding deliberately in every interaction. He died in federal custody in 2023. The FBI now requires agents to take mandatory counterintelligence training that was, in part, built around the failures that allowed Hanssen to operate for so long. He didn't see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as the only honest man in the room. That kind of certainty at Marion's level of isolation had a way of curdling into something even harder to reach. And what waited at number 5 was a man whose certainty had curdled long before anyone thought to stop him.
Number 5. Joseph Jack Mad Dog Sullivan.
There's a specific kind of professional criminal that the justice system is simply not built to handle. Men for whom prison is not a deterrent, not a punishment, and not a pause in criminal activity. It is simply another environment to be navigated, exploited, and when necessary, escaped. Joseph Sullivan was that kind of criminal. Born in New York in the 1930s, Sullivan came up through the school of hard knocks that the city's underworld provided for a certain generation of young men. Street crime first, then graduating into more organized operations, then into the orbit of some of New York's most powerful organized crime figures. He became a contract killer, a professional in the most clinical sense of the word. Sullivan was known in law enforcement circles as Mad Dog, though the nickname was somewhat misleading. He was not erratic. He was not uncontrolled. He was, by most accounts, methodical, a craftsman of violence who approached his work with a seriousness that made him exceptionally dangerous and exceptionally difficult to prosecute. His confirmed criminal history included multiple murders, armed robberies, and a series of prison escapes that became almost legendary within the federal correctional system. Sullivan escaped from multiple facilities over the course of his criminal career, not through elaborate tunnels or Hollywood-style ingenuity, but through observation, patience, and an understanding of institutional routine that came from paying extraordinarily close attention to everything around him. That talent for observation made him valuable to organized crime figures who needed someone who wouldn't panic, wouldn't talk, and wouldn't leave loose ends. Sullivan was all of those things. When law enforcement finally secured a conviction that held, the federal system faced a genuine puzzle. Where do you put a man who has demonstrated repeatedly that conventional maximum security facilities cannot contain him? The answer was Marion. Inside Marion's control unit, Sullivan was placed under the kind of monitoring that left almost no room for the kind of patient observation that had always been his most dangerous skill. The irony was noted by more than one correctional official. They were, in effect, trying to out-patience the most patient man they had ever encountered. Sullivan's behavior inside Marion was studied carefully. He interacted minimally, disclosed nothing, and maintained a baseline of compliance that gave authorities very little to work with disciplinarily. Staff noted that he seemed to regard the entire institutional framework, the rules, the schedules, the personnel, as variables to be understood rather than authorities to be respected. He was not a man who hated the system. He was a man who simply didn't acknowledge its legitimacy. For the psychologists who worked the Marion population, Sullivan represented a type that defied easy categorization, not antisocial in the explosive sense, but profoundly detached from social contract in a way that was almost philosophical. He died in prison, having never successfully escaped again. But the question his case leaves behind is deeply uncomfortable. How many men like Sullivan moved through the system undetected simply because they were better at appearing ordinary than anyone around them realized? The answer, at Marion, was likely more than one. And number 4 had made a career out of that exact question.
Number 4. Stanley Tookie Williams. Few men in USP Marion's history carried with them the weight of as many lives as Stanley Williams. Not just the lives that were lost, but the lives that were shaped, distorted, and ended by an organization that he helped build from the ground up. Tookie Williams was born in 1953 in New Orleans and raised in South Los Angeles during a period of urban turbulence that was reshaping American cities in ways that are still being felt today. In 1971, at the age of 17, Williams co-founded what would become the Crips, a street gang that began in the neighborhoods of South LA and eventually spread into one of the largest and most influential criminal organizations in the United States. The Crips, in their earliest formation, were a response to a specific social environment, young men seeking structure, protection, and identity in communities that offered very little of any of those things through legitimate channels. Williams, by his own later accounts,
understood exactly what he was building. He was intelligent, charismatic, and capable of the kind of organizational thinking that, in different circumstances, might have built companies or political movements. He built something else. By the late 1970s, the Crips had expanded dramatically, and the violence that accompanied that expansion was substantial. In 1979, Williams was arrested and charged with 4 murders, a convenience store robbery during which an employee was killed, and the subsequent murders of 3 members of a family during another robbery. The cases against him were built on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, and Williams maintained his innocence in the murders for the rest of his life. He did not deny his broader role in gang leadership. He simply denied these specific crimes. The trial produced a death sentence. Williams was sent to California's San Quentin, but his federal connections and classification during certain periods placed him within the broader federal maximum security framework, with transfers through USP Marion system during specific holding periods. Inside maximum security, Williams underwent a transformation that became one of the most debated stories in the history of criminal rehabilitation. He renounced gang life. He wrote a series of children's books explicitly designed to steer young people away from the path he had walked. He co-authored a memoir. He was nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize by international advocates who believed his anti-gang outreach work had genuine impact. The debate over Williams was never simple. Law enforcement officials and the families of his alleged victims saw the rehabilitation narrative as manipulation, a performance designed to avoid execution. Anti-death penalty advocates and community organizers saw a man who genuinely changed and whose continued voice was more valuable than his death. California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger denied clemency in 2005. Williams was executed in December of that year. What makes his psychological profile so complex is the coexistence of genuine destruction and what appeared to be genuine transformation. Whether those things can occupy the same person simultaneously, whether redemption is possible alongside responsibility for mass suffering, is a question that his case forces into sharp relief. It remains unanswered. But the next man on this list never asked that question, not once.
Number 3. Richard Speck. There are crimes that define a moment in American history, that fracture the national consciousness so cleanly that the country is measurably different afterward. Richard Speck's single night of violence in July 1966 was one of those crimes. On the night of July 13th, Speck entered a townhouse on the south side of Chicago that served as a dormitory for student nurses from South Chicago Community Hospital. What followed over the next several hours was a methodical, almost incomprehensible act of mass murder that left 8 young women dead and changed how America thought about random, stranger-perpetrated violence forever. One woman survived, Corazon Amaral, by rolling under a bed and remaining perfectly still while the violence unfolded around her. It was her testimony that would ultimately send Speck to death row. Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois in 1941, and his early life was a catalog of instability. His father died when he was 6, his mother remarried a man with a violent temper, and Speck spent his formative years cycling through trouble with law enforcement, alcohol, and a simmering rage that people who knew him described as always present, always just beneath the surface. He had a tattoo across his arm that read, "Born to Raise Hell." Investigators found him within days of the murders, not through any particular investigative brilliance, but because Speck had gone on a drinking binge and attempted suicide in a Chicago rooming house. A doctor treating him recognized the tattoo. The rest was mechanics. His trial was one of the most publicized in American history to that point. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all 8 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death, a sentence that was commuted to 8 consecutive life terms in 1972, following the Supreme Court's temporary halt of capital punishment.
Speck arrived in the Illinois state system, but his case and federal classification placed him in contact with USP Marion's network during the facility's peak control years. Inside maximum security, Speck was regarded with a particular kind of contempt, even among a prison population that had committed extraordinary violence. The murder of 8 young women in a single night generated a specific hostility from other inmates. He didn't appear to be bothered by it. In 1988, contraband videotape footage was secretly recorded inside his prison housing unit, footage that showed Speck in a manner so odds with the monstrous public image that it disturbed even those who had studied him professionally. He appeared relaxed, comfortable. In the footage, he made casual references to the murders with an absence of affect that forensic psychologists later described as among the most chilling documented examples of sociopathic detachment they had encountered. He died of a heart attack in 1991. The nurse who survived, Corazon Amaral, gave interviews decades later that humanized the victims with a precision and dignity that stood in sharp contrast to Speck's complete inability to acknowledge them as human beings. That contrast is perhaps the most psychologically instructive thing about his case. But as disturbing as Speck's crimes were, the man at number 2 operated at a different level entirely, a level of organization, ideology in reach that made individual violence seem, in its own terrible way, almost comprehensible by comparison.
Number 2. Whitey Bulger. If Thomas Silverstein was the most feared man in USP Marion's general population, then James Whitey Bulger was something the prison system had even less framework for. A man whose danger was almost entirely institutional, almost entirely invisible, and almost entirely backed by the United States government. For decades. Bulger was born in 1929 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, the working-class Irish Catholic neighborhoods of South Boston that would become both his power base and his mythology. From an early age, he demonstrated the combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and personal charisma that would define his criminal career. A man who understood that power wasn't just about physical dominance, but about information, relationships, and the careful management of perception. By the 1970s, Bulger had risen to lead the Winter Hill Gang, the dominant Irish-American organized crime organization in Boston. He was, by this point, also secretly an FBI informant, a status that he leveraged with extraordinary skill for more than a decade, using his relationship with corrupt FBI agent John Connolly to eliminate rivals, avoid prosecution, and effectively operate with the tacit protection of federal law enforcement. The crimes committed under Bulger's leadership during this period were extensive and deeply violent: extortion, drug trafficking, and a confirmed body count that federal prosecutors ultimately placed at 19 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher. In 1994, tipped off that a federal indictment was imminent, the tip reportedly coming from his FBI contacts, Bulger disappeared. He spent the next 16 years living under a false identity in Santa Monica, California, with his long-term companion, Catherine Grigg. He appeared on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list for years, eventually ranking second only to Osama bin Laden. He was captured in 2011 at the age of 81 after a public tip following an FBI outreach campaign focused specifically on Grigg's appearance. His trial in 2013 was a systematic dismantling of the mythology that had surrounded him for decades. Witnesses described murders in clinical detail. Former associates testified about the mechanisms of his power. The jury convicted him on 31 of 32 counts, including 11 murders. Bulger's time within the federal maximum security system, including periods within Marion's network, placed him in contact with a correctional infrastructure that recognized him immediately as someone who understood institutional power dynamics in ways that most inmates didn't.
Staff noted that he was observant, engaged in conversation selectively, and seemed always to be calibrating, assessing every interaction for information and advantage. He was transferred to USP Hazleton in West Virginia in 2018, where he was murdered by fellow inmates within hours of arrival. He was 89 years old. The manner of his death, beaten to death allegedly by a mob associate with family ties to one of his victims, suggested that even at the end, the debts Whitey Bulger accumulated over a lifetime never stopped being called in. His legacy within American organized crime, federal law enforcement corruption, and the sociology of institutional power is still being fully understood. But even Whitey Bulger, with all his reach and all his influence and all his protected years of violence, was not considered the most psychologically disturbing presence that USP Marion ever contained. That distinction belongs to someone else entirely.
Number 1. John Wayne Gacy. There is a specific and particular horror reserved for the discovery that evil has been hiding not in the shadows, but in the light. John Wayne Gacy did not look like a monster. He threw neighborhood parties. He shook hands with politicians. He dressed as a clown for children's birthday celebrations. He ran a successful contracting business, employed young men from his community, and was regarded by virtually everyone who knew him as a reliable, generous, civic-minded member of his Chicago suburb. Underneath his house, he had buried 26 human beings. Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago, the son of a Danish-American father whose emotional distance and frequent criticism left marks that psychologists would later examine at extraordinary length. He grew up working hard for approval he rarely received, a pattern that manifested in adulthood as an almost compulsive need to present a version of himself that was successful, likable, and respected. The construction of that facade was one of the most elaborate and sustained acts of psychological deception in American criminal history. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy murdered 33 young men and boys, most of them lured through false promises of work or simply overpowered. He buried the majority of them in the crawl space beneath his home in Norwood Park Township. When the space ran out, he disposed of 5 more victims in the Des Plaines River. He was not discovered through investigative brilliance. He was discovered because the family of a 15-year-old named Robert Peast, who had gone to speak with Gacy about a summer job and never come home, pressed local police until they pressed harder. A search of Gacy's home revealed the crawl space. The smell alone told investigators what they were about to find. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. He eventually confessed. His trial in 1980 was a landmark in the legal history of the insanity defense. His attorneys argued that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, that the killings were committed by an alter ego, not the man who sat in the courtroom. The prosecution presented a meticulous record of planning, concealment, and deliberate action that demolished the argument. The jury took less than 2 hours to return a guilty verdict on all 33 counts. He was sentenced to death. On death row, Gacy painted clown paintings, self-portraits, images of Disney characters. He sold them to collectors. He gave interviews. He maintained to the end that the judicial system had failed him. The Federal Corrections Network, which evaluated Gacy during various periods of his incarceration, placed him within Marion's assessment system on multiple occasions, a process designed to categorize the psychological profile and security risk of high-profile offenders. What evaluators encountered was a man who could be in the same conversation both completely forthcoming and utterly opaque. He discussed his crimes with an emotional flatness that evaluators found deeply disorienting. Not because he was cold, he could be warm, charming, even funny, but because the warmth and the description of what he had done occupied the same conversational space without apparent friction.
He didn't seem to experience them as contradictory. That was what set Gacy apart from virtually every other inmate in USP Marion's history. Silverstein was violent and knew it. Bulger was powerful and leveraged it. Hanssen was duplicitous and understood himself as such on some level. Gacy seemed to genuinely struggle to understand why the world did not see him as he saw himself, as a good man who had done some things that were difficult to explain. The gap between those two realities, who he believed himself to be and what he had done, is perhaps the most disturbing psychological space that American criminal history has produced. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. A final note that never stops being unsettling. Forensic investigators, using modern DNA technology, have continued to identify victims from Gacy's crimes in the decades since his death. In some cases, families waited more than 40 years to learn the fate of someone they had never stopped looking for. The bodies in the crawl space were found, but the full human cost of John Wayne Gacy, in grief, in unanswered questions, in lives unmade, has never been and may never be fully counted. That is the true horror of Demon Number 1. Not the clown makeup, not the crawl space, but the absolute, unshakable ordinariness that hid everything underneath.